I want to apologize to the body for any frightening of young children that may have occurred because of the photograph that appears in the program. Unfortunately, unlike Donnie Kennedy, I do not have a better-looking twin brother whose photograph could have been substituted. So I apologize for that. When you ask a preacher to speak, I guess you should expect that at some point you're going to hear a little bit about the Bible. That's not the total focus of what I have to say this morning, but in any discussion of the Bible teaching on civil government, one of the first texts you're apt to hear quoted is Romans chapter 13 at verse 1. Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, for there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God. Some who take the Bible seriously believe that this verse and those which follow oblige Christians to an unqualified obedience to the civil magistrate. Others, who are equally serious about the importance of biblical teaching, are not so sure that is the case. If you type Romans 13 into your search engine on the computer, link to the internet, you will quickly discover that the meaning of this passage is hotly debated. Without disputing the legitimacy of the importance of that debate, I would like to suggest that there are passages besides Romans chapter 13 that ought to be considered in discussions about the biblical view of the civil magistrate. Passages which in fact may prove to be a good deal more useful in our understanding of the nature of civil government, and which may also provide a context significant to the way in which the admonition found in Romans chapter 13 is to be viewed. Now, specifically, I'm thinking of the characterization of civil government that is found in the 8th chapter of the first book of Samuel in the Old Testament. 1 Samuel chapter 8, as you may know, is to do with the expressed desire of the people of Israel for a king to lead the nation. In their request for a king, they specified that this king should be like the kings of all the nations. Now, that wording, I think, is important and significant. Israel had a king. His name is Jehovah. There was also provision for a king in their law, but Israel was not interested in having a king whose royal pomp and circumstance was far removed. They wanted that nearer at hand, more visible, more impressive to the eyes of the flesh. They wanted a king like all the nations. God's prophet Samuel, who had been judge in Israel for many years, was not pleased with Israel's request. But when he took the matter before the Lord, he was told to give the people what they wanted. Now therefore hearken unto their voice, God told Samuel, howbeit yet protest solemnly unto them, and show them the manner of the king that shall reign over them. At which point there follows such a description of the parasitic nature of civil government as should resonate strongly with us today. kind of king the people of Israel wanted, God said, a king like unto those of all the nations, would take their sons and appoint them for himself, for his chariots, and to be his horsemen, and some shall run before his chariots. In other words, there would be a military draft. Moreover, there would be a bureaucracy charged with supplying the war machine, captains over thousands and captains over 50s who would be set to ear his ground and to reap his harvest and to make his instruments of war and instruments of his chariots. Nor would even the daughters of the people be exempt from the king's service. He will take your daughters to be confectionaries and to be cooks and to be bakers. Today, I suppose we would be inclined to count ourselves fortunate if this were all that our modern political leaders wanted from our daughters, or from our sons, for that matter. The people were further warned concerning this king of their desire, that he would take their fields, their vineyards, and their olive yards, even the best of them, and give them to his servants. Eminent domain, I would judge, as per the Kelo decision of the U.S. Supreme Court. He will take the tenth of your seed and of your vineyards, the ones you were allowed to keep, that is, and give them to his officers and to his servants, taxes to support government services, no doubt. If only our modern rulers took but a tenth of that which we own. And he will take your men servants and your goodliest young men and your asses and put them to his work. Asses in service to an ass, I suppose. He will take the tenth of your sheep, and here's the kicker. Ye shall be his servants. Ye shall be his servants. Anytime you hear a lying politician, but I repeat myself, anytime you hear a politician talk about serving the people, just remember this recital on the way government works. And remember who really gets served by government. You may remember 40 years ago or so, the old Twilight Zone television program, there was an episode, it was entitled To Serve Man, and it was all about a spaceship coming down, and this book was being passed out among the people with the name To Serve Man. That's the only thing they'd figured out until a lot of people had been hauled into the spaceship and it was leaving, and somebody came rushing up and they discovered that it was a cookbook. And that's pretty much the way it is with us. We're being served up well done to the powers that be. Now, the situation that precipitated Israel's demand for a king, like the kings of the nations around them, was what might best be described as a crisis of confidence. Now, such crises were common in the history of Israel, going back to the time of the Exodus, when the people found themselves, as it were, between the devil, Pharaoh, and the deep blue sea. And they asked Moses if it was because there were no graves in Egypt that he had led them forth to die in the wilderness. In the situation set out in 1 Samuel chapter 8, the crisis of confidence was occasioned by the fact that Samuel was getting old, and his sons, whom he'd appointed to succeed him, were a couple of sorry individuals who took bribes and perverted justice. They would have made excellent United States congressmen. But the people of Israel, sensing that a George W. Bush moment was upon them, in the time dishonored fashion, concluded that the problem with government facing them would best be served by more government. Now, I hope you understand that I do not mean to trivialize the biblical account of Israel's ill-conceived demand for a king like the kings of the nations around them. As preacher of the gospel, I well understand that the true significance of that incident, or at least the biblically contextual significance of this incident, is to be found in connection with the unfolding of God's purpose, culminating in his revelation in Jesus Christ. And when it comes to the Old Testament, I'm a literalist in a way that some perhaps would not approve, but one of the consequences of my view of the Old Testament is that I do not look upon the incidents recorded therein as simply a nice collection of stories to tell the children in Sunday school.
Amen.
The Old Testament is preeminently a record of the mighty acts of God in saving his people. In 1 Samuel 8, the incidents recorded there, as well as the rest of Old Testament history, these give very strong evidence that saving work was very much needed. That being said, I do not think it is unwarranted in this non-ecclesiastical setting to draw upon examples which in some sense parallel the circumstances in which we find ourselves today. The theme of our conference is Southern secession as the antidote to empire and tyranny. And there are obviously many directions. We've already seen that there are many directions in which this theme might be developed. One of the more pressing and pervasive aspects of the situation facing us, I think, is at least somewhat related to the crisis of confidence that led the people of Israel to demand a king, even in the face of admonitions to the effect that the kind of king they wanted would prove to be a parasitic tyrant. As a churchman, I believe the promises of Christ that he will so build his church that the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. Have no patience with the kind of hand-wringing despair that is evident in a mailing I received some months ago, gloomily predicting that unless something is done, some dramatic effort is undertaken, that ours may be the last generation in America to see the church in existence as a Bible institution. I have no patience with that sort of thinking. As a citizen of the state, on the other hand, I find it interesting that nothing much has changed over the span of the centuries in regard to the misplaced confidence in government that characterizes many, if not most people. Like Israel of old, people through the ages, down to this very hour, have allowed fear, crisis of confidence, to overshadow sound thinking, sound advice. They believe that the answer to the proven inability of government to provide whatever kind of security they are seeking, they believe that the cure for that is to submit to more and bigger and ever more costly and ever more invasive government. And nowhere is the folly of this more clearly evident than in connection with the deference now that is being paid and the power that is being ceded to the so-called law enforcement establishment in cities and towns and villages all over this country. I do not believe that it can be seriously disputed, except of course by those who have a direct interest in the matter and whose vested interest requires that they deny it. I do not believe it can be seriously disputed that we are moving, some would say we are running rapidly in the direction of a full-scale police state. Nor do I believe that there's anything accidental about this, nor for that matter do I think that this is something that has come about only recently. When I was a boy, back somewhere shortly after Moses left Egypt. The chief of police in the community where my family resided was a man named Harry Rhinesmith. I imagine somewhere back in the family history it was Rhinesmith. He had a very obvious German appearance to him. He sort of had the build of a fire plug, and he had the face of a bulldog, you know, with the jowly type face. Chief Rhinesmith, by the time I knew anything about him, had been a police officer for quite a while. When he retired in the early 1960s, I remember there was some reference to him as being the dean of peace officers in that region. I thought at my young age that this designation, the dean of area lawmen, that was pretty impressive until someone explained to me that it simply meant that Chief Rhinesmith had been a policeman longer than anyone else around him. And any lingering notion I had that being the dean of something was a position of honor, that was pretty well dispelled after having dealt with a few college deans, but that's by the point. To say that Chief Rhinesmith was from the old school would be something of an understatement. I'm pretty sure that any training he had was of the on-the-job variety. Like many another man of that era, he probably became a policeman because he needed a job. And here was one that did not require a lot of effort and only the occasional brush with anything that might be considered dangerous. He wore a uniform that, while it may not have been the same one that he had been wearing for the past 35 or 40 years, it certainly was of the same style. He carried a .38 caliber revolver that looked like it might have merged with the leather holster of his Sam Brown belt. On the seat of his patrol car, which was black from tire to top, with one of those old red bubble lights sitting atop it, nothing like the garishly festooned carnival wagons that policemen drive around in today. On the seat, he kept a small leather-enclosed piece of iron that I do not doubt he could have wielded with considerable effect if sufficiently provoked. My impression is that he was very little concerned with the enforcement of any law. His principal function was to keep the peace. And as long as you did not bother him or someone who called for his assistance, there was little likelihood that he would bother you. My sole contact with him was on those occasions when he would stop to give me a ride when I was walking from my home, which was 1 mile from the soda fountain at the drugstore downtown, where I could buy a small Coke whipped up from Coke syrup and carbonated water for 6 cents. But that was pretty much my relationship with Chief Rhinesmith. Now, Harry Rhinesmith was what used to be known as a peace officer. We do not have many peace officers anymore. What we have now are law enforcement officers. And they have been trained to think of themselves in that way. And they have a code book full of laws from which they can pick and choose one or more offenses with which to charge you pretty much for just showing up in their line of vision. And every time the state legislature meets, they get a new supplement for their code book. These law enforcement officers are often found residing in vehicles which have the words "to protect and serve" prominently displayed upon them. that should send anyone who sees those words into gales of laughter.
Amen.
Now, I would not want to suggest for one moment that there is anything insincere in this motto. The men who ride in these vehicles, many of them anyway, are absolutely dedicated to protecting and serving. Protecting each other and serving their own interests and the interest of the state.
That's right.
As far as the general public is concerned, their motto might as well be to harass and intimidate. Now, please understand, we're not talking about corrupt individual police officers in the way that one might used to talk about that, might be used to talking about that. There are those, of course, who are crooks. There always have been. There are crooked lawyers, and there's some crooked preachers, and that's just pretty much the way it is. But the problem which is facing us today is a terribly corrupted system which co-opts, I think, men who in many respects are otherwise decent people, and leads them to believe that they are invested with special privileges as a group, setting them apart from all other groups in our society. And I believe this attitude is cultivated among these people. It is reinforced by the fact that they pretty much associate only with others of their profession. Particularly, I think that's true in cities, to a lesser degree in small towns, rural areas. In years past, now this might have involved something as innocuous as driving down the highway at speeds well in excess of the posted limit that other drivers were expected to observe, or perhaps free coffee and donuts at the local diner, or a discount on meals purchased while on duty. But now the attitude taken by many officers is that deference must be paid to them as sort of a matter of legal obligation. Now, I know something about this, just as well as to make this clear somewhere in here, that I know something about this because I have worked for about 30 years in the peace officer profession, in addition to my responsibilities as a pastor. And I didn't always consciously think of myself as a peace officer, but I used to think about it. I used to be a member, in fact, of the Mississippi Law Enforcement Officers Association. Now, think about the name there. Think about the name. There is another organization in Mississippi. It's called the Magnolia Peace Officers Association. I wish I could believe that they actually understood the distinction. I do not think that they do. But there are those who do understand and who do follow that. But I just want to make that clear, that I'm not talking about this as someone who has observed this from afar. I've seen what takes place close at hand. Just to give you an example of how close at hand, I was working one night and received a call from one of the agents of the Bureau of Narcotics in the state of Mississippi. He wanted me to meet him at a certain location. And when I went to that location, he had been dealing with someone who was in one of these large motorhomes. And he was thinking in terms of perhaps running this person on one of the intoxilizers to see if he might be driving under the influence. In the course of the conversation, he talked about how this man had been acting kind of strange, and he pointed to his recently issued taser and said that he had been looking for an opportunity to try this thing out. Now, as I say, there is an attitude now among many of these people that deference must be paid to them as a matter of legal obligation. Take, for example, the laws recently enacted in many states which require other drivers, require drivers on the roadway to slow down or preferably to change lanes when approaching an emergency vehicle, read police cruiser, on the shoulder of the highway, engaged in some activity, some emergency activity, such as writing a citation to someone whom they've caught on radar driving a few miles per hour faster than the posted limit. Now, leaving aside the fact that this requirement actually increases the possibility of crashes caused by vehicles suddenly reducing speed or changing lanes, these new laws simply provide another opportunity for revenue enhancement. I fully expect that before too long, where once were speed traps, police agencies will be setting up decoy traffic stops with information on drivers not displaying proper obeisance, radioed ahead to officers waiting down the road to flag them down and to cite them for being such horrible miscreants. By the way, reading through a list of officers killed in the line of duty in a magazine some time back, I was interested to see that I believe it was over half of those officers were killed in car crashes. Many of them one-car events. Which means that they were on their way to some supposed emergency and either ran off the road into a tree and lost control of the vehicle and wound up flipping the car or something because they were going so fast, or they were killed while standing in the middle of the highway by a vehicle whose driver did not see them, being distracted, no doubt, by all the lights and the confusion. Many police officers seem to think that a festively painted car with flashing lights and a uniform and a badge will trump the laws of gravity and inertia, which apply to lesser souls. There is a reason, and I understand that there are police officers who have given their lives in situations which have demonstrated great heroic, a greatly heroic attitude. I don't discount that, but I also think that there is a reason why on the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial, the wording there declares it is not how these officers died, but how they lived that is important. Because the way that some of them died simply is ludicrous. Everything now is arranged to maximize the number of citations issued and the amount of revenue collected therefrom, with a minimum of effort on the part of these law enforcement officers. In that respect, very little. My mother used to tell me that people who went into police work really did so because they didn't want to have to work too hard.
Amen.
And that was true, I'm pretty sure, of Harry Ryan Smith, and I think it's true of those today. To cite another example, at one time, and I go back far enough in this to know, at one time, finding people to charge with driving under the influence of alcohol required an officer to actually patrol, to drive his car around, and to observe the driving of a suspected offender. And if there was probable cause and reasonable suspicion, and I can't tell you how many times I heard that phrase intoned in classes on how to run these photoelectric intoxilizers and so forth, that there was probable cause and reasonable suspicion that someone was committing this offense of driving under the influence. So let's say that the suspect is cleaning out ditches on both sides of the roadway. That's an indication that there's probably some impairment in the case of this individual. Then the driver would be stopped and appropriate tests run to determine the blood alcohol level. Now this, of course, was a bit too much work. And so now you have sobriety checkpoints where the police stick their heads into the vehicles passing through their roadblock, sniffing for the smell of alcoholic beverage, or even better, the smell of other substances, looking for bleary eyes, and attempting to spot any contraband that might be present. I was surprised recently at the frankness of an officer in the Natchez Police Department who was quoted in a story in the Macomb Enterprise Journal, who stated in no uncertain terms that the purpose for driver's license checks, where you must show your documents, and insurance card checks and such as that, the purpose really was to give the police the opportunity to get their head in the vehicle, to look around for anything that might seem suspicious. He admitted this, quite frankly. These sorts of things, however, amount to nothing more than slight inconveniences in comparison with the havoc that has been wrought by the militarization of police forces, even in small communities. Even in small communities. You probably noticed that more and more officers routinely patrol now, dressed in combat boots and what are known as BDUs, battle dress uniforms, which seems to raise the question what sort of battle is it that they are expecting to have to engage. Now, if you'd asked Harry Ryan Smith about BDUs, he probably would have thought you were talking about BVDs, and he would have rapped you upside the head with that little black leather piece of iron that he carried around. Many officers, now you see them all the time, they've got their heads shaved, and they have this swaggering aspect. Shaving the head, that's something that's always kind of mystified me. Mine keeps falling out. My hair keeps falling out just all on its own. I don't know why it is that people want to do that. But they look, and in all too many cases, they act like the pictures that you see on the History Channel of those old SS officers from Nazi Germany.
Yes, sir.
And they seem also, like this man I spoke of earlier, to be looking for the opportunity to use their weapons. And God help the poor soul who is on the receiving end of one of these no-knock drug raids carried out on a wrong address.
That's true. Oh, yeah.
Like the elderly lady in Atlanta who was gunned down by some of these thugs several months ago. A young man named Corey May of Prentiss, Mississippi, who was watching television in the bedroom of his home with his infant daughter when the police broke down his door, and he shot one of the officers, who later died, and now Corey May sits on death row at the Mississippi State Penitentiary for the crime of killing an intruder who had no legal right to be in his home. And we, of course, know all about Waco and Ruby Ridge We see over and over again how the law enforcement establishment protects and serves its own, even when they're guilty of the most heinous abuse of their position and of actions which would be charged as crimes against civilian offenders. And this is to say nothing, of course, of the prosecutorial abuse, such as was evident in the criminality of the repulsive Mike Nifong in his vendetta against the Duke University lacrosse players, and in the career of the equally execrable Rudolph Giuliani. Well, we could go on in this vein, but I must bring this to an end. You may ask what all of this is to do with Southern secession. Well, I really think it's pretty obvious. I would reply that the sorts of things we've been talking about, the sort of parasitic and tyrannical behavior that is evident all too often in the modern law enforcement culture, that this is closely related to the whole scheme to federalize and to centralize police administration in this country in order to control and intimidate the citizen.
Yes, sir.
The exponential increase in police presence and intrusiveness and abuse of power is unquestionably a direct result of the crisis of confidence that has been carefully cultivated by the federal Leviathan, which, by the use too of grant money and various regulations, is seeking to consolidate control over the citizenry of the country. You know, you can go to meetings where federal representatives, they'll tell you about all the money that's available, and they practically beg you to take this money for police equipment and so forth. And this is in so many other areas. Supervision needs to be reassumed by local communities, and secession is the only reasonable antidote to what must otherwise, I think, further degenerate into a tyrannical, full-blown police state. It will be either this, or it will be something more drastic in nature. Those of you who are regular visitors to the LouRockwell.com website, you're probably familiar with the writings of William Norman Grigg. He has some pretty good things. He had a picture of an elderly man being arrested in Silver Spring, Maryland, and one of the policemen was rather shall we say, a large fellow. And he captioned this as Jabba the Cop and two other stormtroopers arresting this particular individual. But one of his recent articles, he quoted from Alexander Solzhenitsyn, and you may have read this somewhere along the way, but this is what Solzhenitsyn wrote. And how we burned in the camps later, thinking, what would things have been like if every security operative, when he went out at night to make an arrest, had been uncertain whether he would return alive and had to say goodbye to his family? Or if during periods of mass arrest, as for example in Leningrad, when they arrested a quarter of the entire city, people had not simply sat there in their lairs, paling with terror at every bang of the downstairs door and at every step on the staircase, but had understood that they had nothing left to lose and had boldly set up in the downstairs hall an ambush of half a dozen people with axes, hammers, pokers, and whatever else was at hand. The organs would very quickly have suffered a shortage of officers and transport, and notwithstanding all of Stalin's thirst, the cursed machine would have ground to a halt. If we didn't love freedom enough, and even more, we had no awareness of the real situation. We purely and simply deserved everything that happened afterward. Closer to home, I heard a story some time back about an incident that's supposed to have taken place in one of our Mississippi Revenue Enhancement Courts, otherwise known as the County Justice Courts. Note the oxymoronic designation. A man who was in the court to deal with charges against a couple of drivers he had hired observed an elderly couple of evidently modest circumstances sitting in the court. and the man had a suitcase sitting next to his feet. And when the Justice Court judge, who had only a few minutes before been joking with some of the law enforcement types that were standing around, when he began to call the cases, the first to be heard was that of this elderly gentleman with the suitcase. And it seems that he was the owner of a truck of some description that he used in his little business of selling watermelons. Now, for whatever reason, this truck did not meet certain requirements imposed by the Department of Transportation. And this man had been cited numerous times by the MDOT police in that area. His accumulated liability and fines had reached about $3,000. When called upon by the judge, the man told him that he had come prepared to go to jail. He said, "I've got my suitcase here, and I'm ready to go to jail." He said, "I receive about $6,000 a year from Social Security, and I make another $3,000 or $4,000 working, selling my watermelons. And I can't afford to have the truck fixed, and I'm not going to pay the fine, and you will just have to put me in jail. But I just want to say one thing. People are getting fed up with this kind of thing, and I may not live to see it. But one of these days, they're going to come in here and take every one of you sons of female dogs and take you out here to one of these oak trees around this courthouse and hang every one of them." Now, I cannot vouch personally for the story, but I was told it for the truth. And the man telling the story said that after this elderly gentleman spoke, there was a hasty conference at the judge's desk, after which the judge announced that all charges and fines levied against the man were dropped and dismissed. And not only that, but the cases of everyone else in court that day were being dismissed. I cannot vouch personally for the accuracy of the account I've related, but it would be nice, if it were true, to find out that man's name so that we could institute some sort of League of the South award in his honor. We need to return to that state of affairs in which people are not afraid of the government, but the government is afraid of the people. Absolutely. Well, actually, I guess in a sense we are in that state. They are afraid of us, and therefore they seek to control us. We need to get back to a state of affairs where they are unable to exercise that control. The thought of government bullies hanging from live oak trees and courthouse lawns all over the South has a certain appeal to it. But with the right of secession in place, perhaps we could save the cost of road. The better way is what Dr. Thomas Naylor refers to as the genteel revolution, the way of secession. And we need to pursue it with all due vigor. And I thank you for your attention.